Tim. Welcome everyone to our first session, History and Anthropology in Deep Time, which will be chaired by Alison Adler Inglis Taylor. Alison taught English literature at UCLA and UC Irvine for many years and is now completing a second doctorate in European Environmental History at Merton College, Oxford. She also co-organises the Environmental Humanities seminars at Torch. A very warm welcome to you, Alison.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Tim and Torch and everyone for this day. So, good morning, everyone. We are beginning now the first panel, which is called History and Anthropology in Deep Time with Professor Amanda Power and Dr. Richard Irving. And I'll just introduce the speakers' biographies in just a moment, but just a little bit of housekeeping again, just to reiterate, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A rather, and like Tim said, you have the chance to upvote questions you would particularly like, and each speaker will speak for 15 minutes and have some conversation with each other afterwards, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions as well. So, Amanda Power, our first speaker, is the Sullivan Clarendon Associate Professor in History at St. Catherine's, Oxford. She works on religion, power, and intellectual life in medieval Europe, as well as developing new approaches to historical study that speak to the concerns of mounting climate and environmental crisis. She co-convenes the network on climate crisis thinking in the humanities and social sciences at Torch, and is currently working on a monograph entitled Medieval Histories of the Anthropocene. Dr. Richard Irving is a lecturer in the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of St. Andrews. His research interests span environmental anthropology and the anthropology of religion, and he carries out fieldwork in the UK and Mongolia. He is also the author of An Anthropology of Deep Time, which was published with Cambridge University Press in 2020. So, I would now like to hand over to our first speaker, Professor Amanda Power, who will speak to us on history and anthropology in deep time.
Thank you, and thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to speak here. I'm slightly daunted to find myself in company with so many people who work and have written amazing things about deep time already. I feel that I'm just on the cusp of deep time, but I've really enjoyed thinking about it for today's paper. So I'm going to share my screen. If someone could let me know if I have.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Right. So today I'm going to talk about history in deep time. So a question that's not widely asked, but perhaps should be, is how responsible are historians for today's devastating existential threats to much of life on Earth? What part's being played by the Western historical construction of the human past, the sense of temporality and the meaning on which it's being based, and the ethical imperatives that it encodes? In what ways is the modern professionalized discipline, with its roots in Christian universalism and European imperial and nationalist projects, work to delegitimize other ways of thinking about humans and the planetary past? The European University, which was institutionalized in the 13th century, was from its emergence a place in which knowledge was fragmented into different disciplines, which were organized hierarchically. History was not one of them. It was theologians who produced official narratives of the human past. Drawing on ancient Hebrew mythologies, they told of an ordered garden world created by an anthropocentric deity for humans, and their subsequent punishment of ejection into a different, harsher environment. Here, humans were set perennially at odds with nature, doomed to wresting their needs from hostile landscapes. After a lifetime of labor, they would die. For early Christians and for medieval theologians, this was a situation from which humans needed saving. Humans should never die. Individual human consciousness and identity must last forever. Human bodies should not decay into the soil to support new life, but be resurrected, entire from the earth, to live eternally. The process from human creation and fall to human redemption was identical with the whole history of the planet, from creation to apocalypse. After this, the best humans would be relocated to a pristine site in the stars, the world to come. They became qualified for resurrection specifically by rejecting the joys of bodily life on a bounteous planet and refusing responsibility for the future of earthly life. The theologian's view of history set the framework within which histories were written, and scholarly inquiry into the workings of the natural world was undertaken in the West. While it was obviously susceptible to a range of moral and ideological readings as a story of the planet, it was inescapably anthropocentric. The secularization of this view has made almost no difference to its essentials or to the ethics that it promoted. The Earth and its systems remain subordinate to narratives of human progress and advance. Human progress is still marked out by rejection of an easy habitation of environments in favor of subjecting plants, animals, and landscapes to individual human profit. The future is placed on the same trajectory of progress through domination, and is often imagined as a technologically driven ascent to the stars and colonization of worlds to come. At no point are careful relationships with future human generations or other than human life, much less rocks, water, and air, part of this story. The planet appears an occasionally unruly, but fundamentally stable resource for humans to harness. Deep time itself is a resource in this story, in the sense that it took those untold aeons for minerals and fossils to coalesce in the Earth, and that extracted now fuel modernity. The Carboniferous period, with all the rest, has collapsed into the present, and the race is on to empty and burn every remaining reservoir now. The usable parts of the deep past will soon be gone, and so have no future. From a methodological perspective, as well as a storytelling perspective, the historical discipline is not particularly well equipped to engage with deep time. With the 19th century professionalization of the discipline, which came in the aftermath of the recognition by European intellectuals of the deep time of the planet and evolutionary processes, there was a new division of labor. History, archaeology, anthropology, ethnography, various natural sciences studying different aspects of planet and cosmos became distinct specialisms. History was the study of human societies, and especially the operation of human agency over other humans and over nature, as could be determined through the written sources. The nation state was initially its main geographical and temporal unit. Regions and people passed from prehistory into history when they began to make written records, or when they were conquered by those who did. History and civilization were synonymous. Civilization was achieved and marked out by human advances over nature. Many of our written sources were generated by administrators recording what was owned and what could be extracted year by year, as well as valorizing their acts of domination. This process made the things of the earth enter history. In this context, prehistory was connected to history because it was a container for what was not yet historical, but what would be. Deep time does not obviously fit into this conceptual framework. It eludes the ideological relations of history and prehistory. But how can historians, text-bound as we have been, explore the potential of this different, less ideologically colonized temporal realm? As it happens, the tools we need are becoming increasingly available within the discipline. In the last few decades, historians have begun grappling with the issues raised by a new interdisciplinary engagement between the disciplines that had earlier taken their separate paths. Science-led research into historical climate and environments posed an abrupt challenge to confidence in human agency as the main driver of change on Earth. It showed that humans had always existed within dynamic environments in which incomprehensibly complex interactions were continuously taking place on every scale, from the microbial to the solar cycles. From a conceptual perspective, the discipline was initially ill-equipped to take on these recognitions. The main available category was the negative and nervous one of determinism. Under this lay concern about what would happen to the field if reconstructing the past came to require skills and knowledge which lay outside the training and professional expertise of historians. How would text-based research fit into this larger enterprise? Would historians lose control of the past? Although some remain anxious, the answer has been an exhilarating proliferation of inventive approaches, based on everything from new interdisciplinary collaborations to rereadings of well-known texts and events with fresh eyes and different questions. But for some historians, these questions converge with others that are equally unsettling, but in a different way. The narrative of human progress towards westernized modernity has been looking tattered for some time. Historians have become attentive to the ongoing harms of imperialism, colonialism, slavery, and racism, which increasingly seem inseparable from the greed and remorselessness of those humans who are driving anthropogenic disruptions to Earth systems, placing relentless pressure on biodiversity, and profiting from the saturation of the Earth with radiation and synthetic chemicals. The idea of the Anthropocene, for all its problematic aspects, has become a powerful tool for talking about these connected phenomena. The criteria for locating the boundaries of this proposed new epoch in the geological record are much debated. The whole spectrum of human time was initially under consideration, from the first indications of human use of fire through to nuclear testing in the 1940s. The defining records for the human triumph over nature were no longer only written, but were indelibly layered into the planet itself, as much part of deep time as the preceding eras and all those to come. Yet, given the usual preoccupation of historians with modernity, the Anthropocene has generally been located firmly in the last 2 centuries as a product of industrialization, located, I should say, by historians, geologists and other disciplines place it a bit differently. The temporality remains thin for historians, as if the capacity of life on Earth to remodel dramatically planetary environments was pure and recent human achievement, and one to which, as the scientists and policymakers have it, there are human solutions. If historians do not contest these views more effectively, we will continue to enable the entrenchment of an idea that humans, or at least the most ingenious and pale-skinned of us, will always triumph over disaster, can survive a hothouse Earth, need not worry, need not act, need not demand action from those in power. It's therefore imperative that we make and tell a radically different story. And this story, it seems to me, finds the Anthropocene idea useful, but must root it in deep time. Only here, in deep time, can we develop a sense of the true proportions of things, the true fragility, terror, and wonder of any particular point in the Earth's temporality, or indeed, in the incomprehensible temporality and vastness of the universe. Where should this story begin, this new human, but vastly other than and more than human story? Shouldn't it begin with everything else at the beginning? Our origins lie in that burst of energy and its unfolding forces within which we, individuals, species, ecosystems, planets, solar system, galaxy, are a moment like any other moment in whatever it all is. If historians contemplate the sheer contingency of our existence within this immensity, is there a risk of a silencing alienation? Perhaps. But it depends on what companions we find in the star-studded blackness, how we consider our relations to the matter and energy of the universe, and whether we're prepared to see ourselves as part of it. 13.8 billion years old so far, and constituent elements of us stretching away and shifting assemblages into the reaches of the future. I'm not sure how this is a history that historians can write, but it is a sense of the human place in things that could radically alter what we do write. A more manageable story might begin more recently, 4.6 billion years ago with the formation of our home. Historians such as John L. Brooke have shown that it's possible to write a narrative history that starts here. In this sort of telling, human life on Earth begins with the constituting of the planet. By 3.9 to 3.8 billion years ago, the Earth had the right conditions for the development of life, solar energy, and the inner heat of the planetary core, liquid water, with the right salinity and pH, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, the right temperature, the right pressure on the Earth's surface. In these conditions, it's hypothesized, the universal common ancestor of all life on Earth appeared, single-celled, living in deep-sea hypothermal vents. A few 100 million years later, still in the oceans, bacteria were inventing the means of harvesting energy from sunlight, which would eventually oxygenate the atmosphere, creating the protective ozone layer. It took time before this thinly scattered emerging life had any particular effect on its surroundings, but once it did, there was a co-evolution between life and non-living aspects of the planet. By about 1.7 billion years ago, there was multicellular life, sexual reproduction for about 1.2 to 1.1 billion years ago, and perhaps by 800 to 700 million years ago, fungi and algae were colonizing the previously barren landscapes of a rocky supercontinent, weathering the rock and removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This led to drastic global cooling, perhaps a snowball Earth. The behaviors of life on Earth have distinct commonalities across deep time, regardless of our form. In all this, we can perhaps recognize something of ourselves. And altering the atmosphere, we learn, is not something readily survived. It tends to lead to mass extinctions. Later, we come to periods of flourishing, diversifying, abundant life and more great dyings, beginning with the Cambrian explosion of life around 600 to 500 million years ago. Apes appeared around 25 million years ago. The first Homo species appear between 2.1 to 1.5 million years ago, and our direct ancestors around 60,000 years ago. Most of the time, this ape and human end game of deep time is presented as a strange rupture. The becoming of apes and humans is a distinct event, almost like the old idea of creation. You notice there's nothing before the ape. The ape comes ex nihilo. Deep time embeds our most recognizable ancestors in the vast patterns of life and death to which we all belong, unlike this earlier view of human appearance. One strategy for historians is certainly to write this as narrative, as Brooke has done in his Climate Change in the Course of Global History, subtitled Absolutely a Rough Journey. But historians could tell many other kinds of stories, as well as the deep time narrative. We could tell stories of deep entanglements across time. This long process of habit formation with its drastic reversals in global temperatures and balance of atmospheric gases, its periodic mass extinctions, and its repeated blossoming of life, all of this is our ancestry. It's almost impossible, thinking within the paradigms of Western modernity, to grasp it as a story of absolute co-evolution. But many other cultures would have little difficulty with it. As we've seen, the discipline of history has not had room for what appears to be radical alternatives, but there are places to look and conceptual structures to draw on. So one way perhaps is to think with Aldo Leopold, influential in this area. So I've given you a quotation from one of his essays. X is an atom. X had marked time in the limestone ledge since the Paleozoic seas covered the land. Time to an atom locked in a rock does not pass. The break came when a burr root nosed down a crack and began prying and sucking. In the flash of a century, the rock decayed, and X was pulled up and out into the world of living things. He helped build a flower which became an acorn, which fattened a deer, which fed an Indian, all in a single year. From his birth in the Indian's bones, X joined again in chase and flight, feast and famine, hope and fear. He felt these things as changes in the little chemical pushes and pulls that tugged tirelessly at every atom. When the Indian took his leave of the prairie, X mouldered briefly underground, only to embark on a second trip through the bloodstream of the land. This is a more vivid passage of life and richness of ongoing experience than anything bounded and contained in one human body. This might be another way to tell history. We'd have to think about how to do it. But it might produce an almost Rawlsian ethics for the readers. One final thought. If humans are part of everywhere and everything, histories of deep time might also help us to instill some badly needed boundaries. We in the modern West tend to think of the whole planet as existing in our narrow slice of time, all ours to take. But if we see those billions of years of life and death as having their own place in the past, not the present, we might think more clearly about them. Robin Wall Kimmerer, in Braiding Sweetgrass, talks about the gifts of the earth, the things that are here and now, and ours to take with respect and care to use and value. She contrasts these with the coal that has to be ripped from the earth with violence and ecological devastation. This, she says, is no gift to us, it's not ours to take. That ancient locking up of carbon was integral to making the habitations of the present. We might consider that its removal from the atmosphere was, if you like, a gift of the distant past. But if we see the earth as existing only in the present, we extract it and burn up every last bit and doom ourselves in the process, because we've not invested temporality with meaning or considered seeing deep time as generous to us. Historians can't write these stories alone. It's clear from my paper that it depends enormously on the findings of people working across a whole spectrum of disciplines. But I think that that's actually an important point to be considering today. It's important that this is a conference in humanities rather than a history conference alone or any other independent discipline. It seems to me that the way forward is to bring our disciplinary emphases to a much wider range of methodological and conceptual structures and ambitions for how we can think with tools such as deep time, ending both the disciplinary splendid isolation, but also the splendid isolation created by old histories of humanity that placed us at the center and located the entirety of deep time from human creation to human apocalypse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. That was fascinating. We should move on now to Dr. Richard Irving, And then we'll have some conversation, hopefully, between our speakers after that. Richard, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. So I've been asked to say a little bit about the relationship between deep time and anthropology as a discipline. And I think I first became interested in deep time as an anthropological problem when I was reading about James Hutton in the context of the Scottish Enlightenment, and thinking about the ways in which he codified this idea of the deep time of geological processes, and the effect then that had on those surrounding him. And there's a famous quote by one of Hutton's disciples, John Playfair, which really drove this point home, and I'll read it out. So Hutton had taken Playfair and some others to an unconformity at Siccar Point. So this is a break in the sedimentary sequence indicating the work of erosion over long duration. And Playfair records, "On us who saw these phenomena for the first time, the impression made will not be easily forgotten. What clearer evidence could we have had of the different formation of these rocks and of the long interval which separated their formation? We felt ourselves necessarily carried back to the time when the schistus on which we stood was yet at the bottom of the sea, and when the sandstone before us was only beginning to be deposited in the shape of sand or mud from the waters of a superincumbent ocean. An epoch as still more remote presented itself, when even the most ancient of these rocks, instead of standing upright in vertical beds, lay in horizontal plains at the bottom of the sea, and was not yet disturbed by that immeasurable force which has burst asunder the solid pavement of the globe. Revolutions still more remote appeared in the distance of this extraordinary perspective. The mind seemed to grow giddy by looking so far into the abyss of time." And when I was reading that and reflecting on it, that idea of how we as humans confront and engage with that giddiness looking into the abyss of time seemed to me an important anthropological problem, precisely because so much of the work of society, so much of the work of human day-to-day lives is an evasion of that abyss, an evasion of thinking about the time spans that are necessary for the building up of the resources upon which we depend, and the time spans that are necessary for thinking about the impacts of our lives. And in a sense, what we inhabit is this disinterred present, one that as we just heard, I thought, put very powerfully in the previous presentation, there's a sense of taking the present on its own terms rather than recognizing it as a gift from the past, and also recognizing that we too have our responsibilities to the future. So thinking then about that, what is that effect of looking into these vast spans of time? And in the context of the Anthropocene and this recognition that we're living in a geological epoch of our own making, I think what's striking about the Anthropocene is that it simultaneously humbles and magnifies humankind, because on the one hand, to recognize the Anthropocene is to put human life in that context of a deep time calendar, in which our mind grows giddy, because the infinitesimal span of a human life seems as nothing to this huge geological timescale. But at the same time, the recognition of humans as having this particular impact, this anthropocentric epoch that we find ourselves in, means that we have this bloated presence within that deep time calendar. And so I was very struck by that fact that in the Anthropocene, deep time seems to be something that shrinks us to insignificance. But at the same time, when we're thinking about deep time, we're thinking about precisely how we make it in our own image, and how we take that deep time as a resource for our use in the present, and what the long-term consequences of that are going to be. So I think that there is, I think that there has been, as I'll talk about shortly in this presentation, an increasing recognition of the need to pay attention to these deep time movements within anthropology. I'm going to just give an example of the kind of thinking which shows the need for anthropology to engage with deep time. I'm just going to share I just have the one slide that I want to share. Yeah, hopefully that's sharing. Okay, so this is in Orkney, where I live, and this is on the west shore of Stromness. And we can see here that concrete defences punctuate the shoreline. And from one perspective, these concrete defences seem to interrupt the geology of the shore. So the laminations of the sandstone, which are records of the particular environmental conditions under which sediment was laid down on the edges of a massive freshwater lake some 420 million years ago. We can see in that those fine laminations, you know, these dark laminae, these dark laminae, these light laminae, that tell us something about this deep environmental past. And then you've got this unconformity, this surface, which leaps forward from that 400 million year ago past to our present moment. And that concrete presence then in the calendar of time here, in that calendar of time revealed by the stratigraphy of the sandstone, it's ambiguous. It seems to be part of that calendar, but at the same time it's obscuring it, it's overlaid upon it, and also it's holding that geological history in a kind of suspended animation. The whole point of putting the concrete there, of having these defenses, is precisely to hold the line against the erosion of this shoreline. Concrete here is standing guard against the incursions of the sea. But looked at from a different perspective, that concrete along the west shore of Stromness, it has its own processual history. You can see that different attempts have been made within it to secure the coast with concrete at different times. There are concrete blocks cast separately and placed in gabions. We can see concrete that's been cast in situ. And the concrete bears the traces of the processes that are used to manufacture it and the materials used to shape it. So we can see the timber framework that's used to cast the concrete, leaving the impressions of the grain running across the seawall, like a kind of an expanse of wooden paneling. While these kind of pillows, these Hessian sacks that were filled with cement, left to plug gaps, the sacks waste away in the seawater, leaving only the impression of the Hessian in the solidified cement and occasional threads of sacking in the crevices. And one of the things that I think you can see in this picture is that in many of these locations, the concrete laminations follow the same bedding as the flagstone. It implies a human participation in the geology rather than a contradiction of it. And so this then is Orkney's Anthropocene bedding. And why this, I think, is important to pay attention to as an anthropologist, is that it challenges us in the course of our daily lives to pay heed to the fact that we're living in this geological epoch of our own making. This is a geological intervention that seeks to fix the landscape, inflating humanity's short time span on the deep time of Earth's planetary history by perpetuating the present, right? By holding the line. But as it does that, as it attempts to fix this particular point in the coastline, it reaches that impact forward in time. right? The production of concrete is one of the biggest contributors to human carbon dioxide emissions. So this is something that I feel is a crucial and central task for contemporary anthropology. We need to trouble presentism by expanding our time horizons to recognize the full implications of human activity. And in fact, the production of cement clinker used in that concrete is a process that can only be understood from a deep time perspective. That production of cement is fusing material from two distinct phases in geological history. You need a source of a process. It's decarbonizing that calcium carbonate, and it's been calculated that when we consider that byproduct of decarbonization alongside the releases from fuel used in firing the kilns for the production of cement clinker, that manufacturer is responsible for around 7% of anthropogenic carbon emissions. So it's having a significant impact on the composition of our atmosphere. And yet the ubiquity of cement, its everydayness, is a marker of what it means to live today. This ubiquity, which is a ubiquity not only for our own society, but also for our deep future. And I think it's here that a deep time perspective helps to reveal the temporal disjuncture at the heart of contemporary economic activity. What we're describing is the release of carbon that accumulated under oceanic conditions over millions of years, enabling the production of an economic resource in the present, one which here allows us to hold the line, to try and keep that present going for just a little bit longer. And the consequences of that then contribute to alterations in the composition of our atmosphere that can only be understood in the future geology of the Earth. And so when we see these sea defences at Orkney, what we're seeing is a particularly nasty feedback loop. Our attempts to secure our built environments contribute to the climatic changes which not only threaten those very environments, but also the future survival of many of the species that dwell on this planet. And concrete's work then punctuating time, buying time, somehow locking it in, at least for a while, it tells us something about the human relationship with the fluidity of land and sea, in stories of islands that come and go in the sea. Heather Blether is one of them. These islands that if you stare out to sea, you can just about make it somewhere in the distance, and then it's gone. These are islands that are not on any map, but you could swear that you saw them. And these islands that appear and then disappear into the sea, of course, from a deep time perspective, all islands are those, or all islands are Heather Blether, all islands are those islands that come and go. And we're still trying to win them over in the ways that our folklore speaks of. There have historically been many stories of this type in which these islands, only there for those with eyes with which to view the unseen, people go out and by clutching iron or by consecrating the land with sacred salt, try and win it over from this netherland into our present, into our material world. And we're still trying to, just as the island of Einhallow, for example, in the folklore of Orkney, was won over from the Finn folk with consecrated salt, winning it over for Christendom. We're still trying to win over these islands that come and go, making a solid footing for ourselves. And the presence of concrete in the geological record is a testament to that. It's a testament to the fact that we are still trying to win against this fluidity of land and water. Okay, so as I said, I think that this is a moment within anthropology where there's a wider recognition of this need to confront deep time and humanity's place in it. 2020 was kind of a vintage year for deep time anthropology, independently and without too much knowledge of what was going on. There were 3 books came out in 2020 on this very subject after a previous silence on it. Vincent Iolenti, he wrote a book called Deep Time Reckoning, and he looks at the nuclear waste repository in Finland and works with the people who are forecasting the future conditions that nuclear waste repository will need to face. What does it mean to have to envisage these future glaciations, earthquakes, hundreds of thousands of years from now? What kind of deep time literacy do you need in order to be able to store and lock away nuclear waste? We can't simply put the present out of sight and out of mind in the deep future. We need to think about that ongoing relationship with the future. And that's what Vincent Iolenti traces in his book. Also, Hugh Raffles wrote the Book of Unconformities, which also came out in 2020. And his is a story of loss and endurance. He's writing in the context of bereavement, of the loss of siblings. And what he offers are meditations on rocks, and he's specific into his biographical history and vice versa. It's this conversation between biographical and geological time, which anthropology is trying to grapple with right now. And at the same time, I wrote my book, The Anthropology of Deep Time, whereas Hugh Raffles' book is kind of an elegant meditation garden, and Vincent Iolenti's is a great structure. Mine is more the plumbing. It's not as nice a book to read. It's more about trying to do the philosophical and theoretical wastewater system that we need in order to make deep time a functioning concept within anthropology. So therefore, I would recommend Vincent Iolenti's book and Hugh Raffles's book before getting onto mine, if indeed you do get onto mine. But nevertheless, it's the fact that we've had these 3 different books in 2020, I think is testament to the emergence of a recognition that we need to pay attention to deep time in anthropology. And what that does is it pushes against the almost built-in presentism of our discipline. It expands the time horizons. And what I've sort of tried to highlight in this short paper is the distorting effect of disinterring a particular moment. We need, if we're thinking about the production of concrete, for example, we need to think how that production is not something just in the present, but also something that expands through geological time. The material conditions of our existence can only be understood over deep time. And that recognition, I think, is the challenge for anthropology today. So, Grant, I will leave it there. I'll stop sharing. Right, Grant, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for some really intriguing ways of thinking about the layers of our own condition and how they are beholden to far greater time structures than we usually think of in our present daily life, as Richard mentioned. What I'd like now, if possible, is to get you perhaps talking to one another about your different approaches to this problem, which aren't admittedly different. They're different disciplinarily, but what I was really struck by, as I said, is that you're both talking about the layers of deep time and how we might rethink those layers and our relationship to them. So if I could get you maybe to talk a little bit about how each of your disciplines or your respective disciplines might talk to one another about those things a little bit more. I know you've both kind of touched on that, but maybe if you could just kind of think about, in terms of your papers or talks that you've just given, what sort of connections do you see that you could make between history and anthropology?
Do you want to start, Amanda? Shall I?
Uh,
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I think this is a good question, because in some ways this is part of a longer debate that there's been within anthropology, and which, you know, I see this moment thinking about deep time as part of, which is that question of, well, what is the proper relationship between history and anthropology? When Bronislaw Malinowski developed the method of ethnographic fieldwork that characterizes anthropology as a discipline now, he did so in opposition to previous evolutionary schemas of thinking about anthropology and conjectural histories that placed different cultures on, you know, evolutionary timelines. And he did so with very good reason, and instead said, no, what we need to do is we need to focus on the ways in which cultures function in the present. You know, we need to think about that. But a consequence of that shift in method and shift in attention has been this idea that, you know, that disinterring of culture from that longer history. And so you get anthropologists like Evans Pritchard in the 1950s saying, well, actually, no, we need to think about how the institutions in a particular society came to be what they are. We need to think about what are the resources that can help us to understand change over time, you know, trying to put the history back in after it had been sort of taken out of anthropology. And but in that sense, there's always a kind of a tension, I think, in anthropology between this presentist method, you know, this deep attention to what's going on here and now, and the recognition that, you know, the conditions for everything that's happening in the present, you know, you can't understand those only on the terms of the present, and ultimately, in that sense, history has always kind of been an inconvenient truth to modern anthropology, and it then needs to be there as this counter narrative to the presentism of the discipline. And I think that this thinking about deep time is just one push against that anthropological presentism.
Well, I think similarly, for history, anthropology has been enormously important, sort of for the opposite set of reasons, that I do see the two disciplines as very closely related in how they've helped. I mean, maybe they should never have been separate, but how they've helped each other sort of co-evolve, if you like, in recent decades. And I suppose there's quite a lot of, I wouldn't say expert, but quite a lot of slightly arbitrary reading in anthropology behind the way that I've been trying to think about what historians might do with deep time. So I suppose historians would draw, I mean, for a long time now, drawn on sort of ideas of kinship relations in anthropology. And as that field has developed within anthropology, the kinship has expanded to include, you know, other than human. And of course, anthropologists in a different way from historians have been interested and have you know, collaborated with different communities in articulating very different worldviews, which are, I don't know that they're ruled out by historical methodology, but it's sort of harder in a way for historians to you know, as disciplinary practitioners to access I suppose what Marisol de la Cadena has called the sort of excess, the things that don't fit into the sort of proper forms of political discourse or historical discourse. And anthropology, of course, is sort of, in a sense, there to do that traditionally. And I mean, I think that this is something historians have sought to improve in all sorts of ways, but we're obviously a lot less effective and skilled at doing it, and we've thought about it a lot less, thought about the ethics of it a lot less. But it seems to me, coming to the question of how historians would engage with deep time, I mean, of course, and I think this relates a bit to something that someone put in the Q&A box. Historians, of course, don't only work in the narrative form, but what I was wanting to think about in my paper is the fact that that historians have very powerfully shaped the kind of basic public concepts of how humans sit in the universe, and the sort of trajectory of time. And people like the narrative form, and historians often deliver the narrative form, particularly when they're being public facing. But but I think that an engagement with anthropology is a good way to problemize and complicate and make that much richer. So can historians draw on methodologies of kinship and connectedness to write about entanglements in deep time? I'm coming to Richard's paper about the use of sand and cement and I suppose the coal references in mine. These are stories to tell, and anthropology helps us tell them.
Great, thank you. So I've been thinking a lot about the Annales School as you've been talking, and their sort of attempts to situate environmental history as the sine qua non of any history, and also of their whole discussion of the longue durée. And I think a lot of their thinking had to do with sociological and anthropological discourse. And I'm wondering, do you both think that that still has something to offer us, or is it something that that has too many limitations for the present moment?
I mean, I'm a big fan of Braudel and the idea of the longue durée. I mean, I don't. It's definitely an influence on. I suppose that question of anthropology engages with the field in its field work, and in order to understand. And this was one of the things that led me to thinking about deep time when I was working in East Anglia, and I was thinking, and I was moving on these peat landscapes, which had then subsequently been drained. I realized that there was no story that you could tell in the present which made sense unless you thought about those tens of thousands of years of peat formation and then the almost instantaneous release of the carbon stored up in that, which is definitely, and that was definitely a longue durée thinking that was kind of partly inspired by Braudel and others. I mean, one thing I would say, just to kind of think about why we can't sort of stop there and need to push further, is that when you read that depiction of the Mediterranean there, yes, there is this idea that what we need to do is we need to think about the landscape as this framing temporality, but at the same time the depiction of that is kind of static. It's this idea of there's the humans as the kind of the foam on the crest of the wave and this kind of thing, but then there's this enduring container which is the geology itself. And of course when we think about that under a deep time perspective, that idea of this slow, almost static landscape doesn't make any sense. That landscape is shifting and transforming and retransforming, and ultimately deep time isn't something that is slow, and so that's one thing we sort of need to be open to moving beyond. But yeah, the longue durée is definitely a formative concept.
I would agree with all that. I think that's quite right. The dynamics of all the layers matter.
So another question, so I thought it was really fascinating that in some ways, Amanda, you sort of approached the topic, and I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but approached the topic in some ways like a medieval chronicler would, because they so often start with Genesis and then move on to their present time. And I'm just wondering, as I think through that, is the West really bereft in its long-term thinking about history of narratives that help us think about our relationship to the world around us in a more humble way? And I kind of go back to thinking about Genesis itself, and also Richard in terms of our implication in landscapes, because the whole narrative in Genesis in some ways is a way of saying, well, we've been extractive and therefore we're being cast out of the sort of paradise of oneness with nature, as it were, although I know that's got many complications. But our condemnation is to be fundamentally disunified from it until we redeem ourselves by regaining a humility in relationship to creation. And again, it's very complicated, I realize, the narrative that I'm invoking, but I'd be really interested to think about whether that or other narratives in the West have not been entirely bereft of ways of thinking about deep time.
I mean, I suppose the starting with Genesis, I mean, that's the kind of container that's captured official time, certainly in the medieval period. And I really do think that the Enlightenment and the secularization processes didn't significantly challenge a lot of the underlying assumptions. That story was sort of there to encode. I mean, of course, there are lots of other ways of thinking in the West as well. This is something that had to be heavily propagandized relentlessly. There's well, in the medieval period, as is well known, a very kind of long process of delegitimizing paganism, or what was called paganism. We don't really know what that was, but it's what we can see from the sources that we have is the reluctance of pretty much everyone to abandon ways of thinking about the natural world that might give individual humans more control, so sort of fertility rituals, or for people, or for landscapes, those sorts of interactions with nature, but also just the kind of immediacy of place. And I think that, and the nostalgia, so many stories of nostalgia for lost, more perfect paradises. I mean, Eden's one, but there are so many others. I think that all these are really important. I mean, one could see them as counterbalancing strands in Western thought. I mean, I think that in some ways, what I'm concerned about are the official narratives, the narratives of the powerful that are sponsored to achieve extraction and profit making. I think that we should have faith in the rest of the population to think in other ways. But historians, as state employees over the centuries, have tended to help elites with narratives that support extraction and valorize it. And I suppose that's why I focused on that aspect of it. But if one wanted to write, and I do also want to write a history that shows a much more nuanced and kind of in some ways hopeful picture, that's there to tell as well.
I mean, I'd agree with all that. I mean, I think when we're thinking about the context of societies like Britain today, I think we need to think when we need to think about alienation in its proper material sense as this sense of loss of connection to the land and to the resources that when we're thinking about this as a disconnection from the means of production, we need to think about that as a disconnection from the material stuff that production comes out of. Because I think that one of the things I have been struck by as I've looking at this topic is that there are, of course, many contexts in which people do have these phenomenal engagements with time over these vast spans, and when I was working in East Anglia, there were the accounts of ditch diggers and farmers who had these very detailed stratigraphies of the peat, and these speculations about what the conditions must have been thousands of years ago that laid them down. And and you can read those stratigraphies of farmers and ditch diggers alongside the stratigraphies of scientific archaeology, which were made possible by those processes of farming and ditch digging, and you can map them onto one another. Similarly, up here in Orkney, there's a whole stratigraphy of the peat that comes from its extraction and burning for use in whiskey production, and the particular parts of the peat have particular flavors, and those particular flavors come from the conditions of their formation. And so there are, as people dig into and engage with the land, there is this sense of encounter with deep time, I think. But when we're thinking about such an alienated context where we don't dig into land and instead we stare into a camera and talk into Zoom, and we don't have any idea where this meeting is taking place. I mean, theoretically, it's taking place in Oxford, but it's probably taking place in some kind of building in the Arctic, you know, which is storing up all of this data. We're completely dematerialized from that, from its geographic context and from its deep time implications. And you know, so there are obviously ways, you know, I don't think it's a cultural thing, so a sense of, you know, Britain as a culture does not have this engagement with deep time, but I do think that there are economic factors which to do with the means of production that lead to us simply being able to not see it as something relevant. It's out of sight and out of mind, like wherever the cloud is.
Thank you. We should probably move on to some questions from our audience, but I will put a little seed of a question for later. Don't feel like you should answer it now, but I'm kind of thinking too of Foucault's archaeologies of knowledge, and I'll just kind of put that out there as another perspective on all of this, but we'll leave that to one side. So we've got one question in the chat that I can see. I'm not sure, let's see if we've got some questions in the Q&A as well. So let me just have a quick look at these and say, so perhaps we could just have a quick think about the question that was in the chat. Do we really need a deep, because I think it's really relevant, do we need a deep time perspective to see the destructive effects of current actions? What does it add or subtract from these issues to think about it in that way? And I think just quickly, it might be useful to kind of give that an answer.
I mean, you know, that's kind of my shtick. So yeah, I do think we need a deep time perspective for it. But the reason is, I think that in a sense this is a challenge to. It's a challenge partly to the human sense of sovereignty over nature and environment, to recognize, you know, that firstly that humans are very latecomers in the scene, but also that the timescales which we depend upon, the resources that we draw from, are timescales which are enormously out of sync with the timescales of our own economic activities. And I think that in a sense, the only way of bringing that disjuncture into relief is precisely to confront the deep time of geological processes, not as something which is distant or not as something which is distant from us or irrelevant to us, not as something which is kind of, you know, which shrinks us to insignificance, but rather to recognize that our lives are within that geology, that they take resources from it and that they contribute to it. You know, that all of these, you know, when we're thinking about deep time, it's not deep time versus humans, it's humans in that deep time. And so yeah, in short, I think that it's necessary in order to expand the time horizons that we have within us, because when those time horizons are placed so short around our activity, then that has a distorting effect. We dematerialize that activity. And I think that the challenge of deep time to humans is that it enables us to shift those time horizons to recognize the full material implications and consequences of our activity. So yeah, I think that deep time is a necessary lens, but you know, other people's mileage might vary.
Thank you. So perhaps you could answer some of the questions that are in the Q&A separately. I'll just ask Amanda if she'd like to take the top question that we had in the Q&A in the few minute or two that we've got left, which is, are there other, could the arts, for example, offer us something, a way of responding to thinking about deep time beyond narrative? Is there some sort of unifying way of apprehending deep time that the arts might offer in opposition to history?
Sorry, how are the arts being defined here? What do you mean?
There isn't really. It says a narrative is great, but only one way of rendering meaning and connections. The arts may offer many other possibilities, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely certain that they do, and I think we've all seen really kind of arresting ways of imagining things visually and in music, and right across the spectrum of the arts and the humanities disciplines. I suppose I would want to separate out history and narrative, because I think that narrative is certainly one way of telling histories. But as I've been sort of wanting to suggest, I think that there are other ways of doing it. I think environmental history, this is something that people are interested in following through in history, is become enormously creative in the way that it talks about these sorts of entanglements. This is just off the cuff example. I'm reading a book called Manual for Survival at the moment by Kate Brown, which is about Chernobyl, and it does an extraordinary job of looking at people and policy and chemicals in the landscapes and how they got there, and as the process of the kind of dispersal of the radiation happened and political choices directed it in different directions. And I mean, that's a relatively small slice of time, but that's a really powerful way of showing a much deeper set of consequences of human activities than you get if you tell a different sort of history. So sort of I guess watch this field for increasingly exciting ways of thinking about these complicated relationships and their consequences.
Great, thank you. We have to stop there, but again, I encourage you both to have a look at the Q&A and chat and see if there are questions you'd like to take on there.
I've had some answers, yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you. And thank you both so much for your talks and for your responses, and for starting off the conference in such a wonderful way. We now have a brief break. I don't know if Tim will want to extend it a bit or not, but our next panel at 10:45-ish will be Theologies and Religions in Deep Time, chaired by Natasha Chola. And thank you so much again.